In 2009, a single company completely dominated the professional world. They controlled more than 55% of the United States smartphone market. They were so deeply integrated into daily life that people referred to their devices as BlackBerry's. Everyone from Wall Street bankers to Kim Kardashian to the President of the United States refused to leave the house without one. At their absolute peak, the company was valued at over $80 billion. They had essentially invented the modern smartphone, creating a secure empire that seemed completely untouchable. But just a few years later, their global market share had plummeted from over 50% in the US and around 20% globally to precisely 0%. This is the story of how the kings of the mobile world completely destroyed their own empire, ignored the biggest technological shift of the century, and lost everything, simply because they refused to let go of a plastic keyboard. To understand how catastrophic this collapse was, you have to understand the sheer addiction of the product. Before BlackBerry, mobile phones were for calling and computers were for emailing. If you were out of the office, you were disconnected. But a Canadian company called Research in Motion, or RIM, led by co-CEOs Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsillie, changed the world by merging the two. They gave professionals something revolutionary, a physical, tactile, QWERTY keyboard that allowed them to instantly answer emails from anywhere on Earth. But the hardware was only half the genius. BlackBerry built an ultra-secure network architecture that routed all messages through their own encrypted servers. It was so bulletproof that governments, militaries, and the largest corporations in the world trusted it implicitly. During the tragic events of September 11, 2001, when cellular networks across New York City and Washington, D.C. became completely overwhelmed and crashed, BlackBerry's data network stayed up. People trapped in the chaos used their BlackBerries to email their families when phone calls wouldn't go through. From that moment on, the device went from a luxury to an absolute necessity. By the mid-2000s, if you were a serious professional, you didn't have a choice. You had a BlackBerry. The company's profits were doubling year after year. The executives running the company felt completely invincible. They owned the corporate world, and nobody could touch them. Then came January 9, 2007. Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone. It had no physical keyboard, a massive glass screen, and a full internet browser. You might think this caused absolute panic inside BlackBerry headquarters. It didn't. In fact, it caused amusement.
Why would anybody want a phone without a keyboard?
What we're going to do is
BlackBerry leadership tore the iPhone apart and concluded it was a fragile toy. It had terrible battery life, it couldn't run on the secure corporate networks that BlackBerry dominated, and most importantly, you couldn't type on it without looking at the screen. BlackBerry executives assumed their corporate customers would never trade the tactile perfection of a physical keyboard for a smudge-covered piece of glass. They weren't the only ones who made this mistake. Across the world, in Finland, Nokia, who controlled nearly 50% of the global smartphone market, did the exact same thing. Nokia's engineers tested the iPhone, decided it was overpriced, fragile because it failed their drop tests, and dismissed it entirely because it lacked a physical keyboard. Both empires suffered from the same fatal hubris. They believed their customers cared more about utility than experience. For a little while, the numbers proved them right. Through 2008 and 2009, BlackBerry sales actually continued to surge. The iPhone was expensive and exclusive to AT&T, but beneath the surface, a massive tectonic shift was happening. The smartphone market was fundamentally changing from a corporate tool used for business emails into a consumer entertainment device. By 2010, the iPhone had an app store, and developers were flocking to it. Google had launched Android, putting touchscreen phones into the hands of the masses. Suddenly, everyday consumers wanted games, social media, beautiful displays, and high-quality cameras. BlackBerry realized they were losing the consumer market and panicked. They rushed out their answer to the iPhone, the BlackBerry Storm. It was an unmitigated disaster. Because BlackBerry was terrified of abandoning the tactile feel of their famous keyboards, they engineered the Storm so that the entire glass screen acted as one giant mechanical button that clicked when you pressed it. They called it Sure Press. In reality, it was practically unusable. The screen crashed constantly, the devices were painfully slow. Verizon, who had partnered with BlackBerry to launch it, faced a nearly 100% return rate from furious customers. It cost BlackBerry hundreds of millions of dollars to replace the defective phones, but more importantly, it cost them their reputation. While BlackBerry fumbled with clicking screens, iPhone and Android were improving at light speed. They were building massive ecosystems, and BlackBerry was about to make their final, fatal error. Hardware wasn't the only thing killing BlackBerry, it was software.
For years, one of BlackBerry's greatest weapons was BBM, BlackBerry Messenger. It was a secure, instant messaging system that didn't charge you per text message. But BlackBerry made it completely exclusive to their own devices. If you wanted to message your friends on BBM, you had to buy a BlackBerry. As iPhones and Androids flooded the market, users begged BlackBerry to make BBM an app they could download on their new touchscreens. BlackBerry stubbornly refused, believing that locking BBM to their hardware would force people to keep buying their phones. Instead, a little startup called WhatsApp stepped in and offered free internet messaging to everyone, regardless of what phone they had. By the time BlackBerry finally surrendered and released BBM for Apple and Android in 2013, WhatsApp had completely taken over the world. BlackBerry had lost their most powerful software advantage for nothing. At the same time, app developers completely abandoned them. Why spend months coding an app for BlackBerry's outdated operating system when hundreds of millions of users were on iOS and Android? BlackBerry released their highly anticipated BB10 operating system in 2013, but the App Store was a ghost town. It was the exact same software death spiral that ultimately killed Nokia's Windows phones. Without the apps people wanted, the phones were useless.
Today, BlackBerry doesn't make phones anymore. The $80 billion valuation evaporated. The empire is gone. Their downfall wasn't caused by a lack of resources or a lack of engineering talent. It was caused by arrogance. They believed that because they defined the past, they were entitled to dictate the future. They listened strictly to their corporate IT managers who only wanted battery life and security. They completely ignored what the rest of the world was becoming. They confused their product, the physical keyboard, with their actual purpose, which was connecting people to the digital world. The physical keyboard was arguably the greatest invention in the history of mobile productivity, until it wasn't. And as BlackBerry learned the hard way, you can invent the future, but if you refuse to adapt when someone else improves it, the future will leave you behind.